Hi everyone, let's look at a particularly rare line in the two knights defense. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, this is known as the Italian game, and if black responds with knight f6, this is called the two knights defense. Now one move for white is to play knight to g5 and attack that f7 square. So the main way to defend against that is to play d5 to block out the bishop. Okay, white can capture the pawn on d5, and now the rare move I want to look at is this counterattack b5, and that's called the Ulvestad variation of the two knights defense. So the point is black's knight is currently under attack, and he can move it, and the main line is in fact to move it to a5. But instead, black decides to counterattack white's bishop. So we're going to talk about the best way for white to respond against this variation. Okay, first of all, I don't advise taking the pawn. It's not terrible, but that allows queen takes d5. The queen gets out here, and the queen puts pressure on both g2 and our bishop. And we might trade the bishop off here like this. But the position seems to be pretty good for black. He's down a pawn, but he has the bishop pair and a lot of space. It's an open game, which is perfect for the pair of bishops. So I don't advise playing like that as white. So we're not going to take the pawn on b5. Another move you might consider that I don't advise is taking the knight and giving up the bishop. For similar reasons here, again, black has a pretty open game with the bishop pair, and it's a mess. The pawn structure is a mess on both sides. White can continue with queen e2 and target both of these pawns, but black can defend them both with queen to d5 and recover the pawn there on c6 and put pressure on g2 again. And so black is doing fine in this opening as well, in this line of the opening as well. Okay, so we're not going to take the pawn, and we're not going to take the knight, so what are we going to do? Well, we're going to move the bishop so it doesn't get captured. Stop and think a minute. Where's the best place to move that bishop? Okay, turns out the best place to move it, and the best move in the position, is bishop to f1. Kind of strange to retreat it all the way back to its original square. Now, here's the point. White is still attacking the knight, and if that knight moves, then this pawn can be captured with check. So the bishop is staying on this diagonal, pressuring that b5 pawn, and he'd like to take it under favorable circumstances. But let's look at a few different moves here in response, and we'll start to understand more why the bishop goes all the way back to f1. Well, one move is for black to capture on d5 with the queen. And if you see that, then you can play knight c3, attacking the queen and simultaneously the b5 pawn. So you're going to win the b5 pawn back on the next move. And now you can understand why that bishop is doing very well on f1. It's defending the g2 square against queen takes g2. So this queen has to move somewhere, perhaps c5, and then white can take this pawn and pin the knight. And white's doing a little bit better in this line than the other ones we saw earlier. So white's okay there if he faces queen takes d5. So another move black might make here is knight takes d5. In that case, we're still going to take this pawn, even though black opened up an attack on our knight. And the point is black cannot take the knight right now because we'll take on c6 with check, and we'll be forking the king, the knight, and the rook. And so we're going to go out material. So black needs to do something to defend this knight. A popular move here is probably bishop to d7. And then white can play d3 and open up a defense for his knight and continue to develop and remain a pawn up. And white has not given up the bishop pair in this line. Okay, but I think the most common move in the position, or maybe the best move in the position, I should say, is to remove this knight from being captured and place it on d4, where it defends the b5 pawn. If you see that move, what you want to do as white is place c3 and provoke that knight off of its square. So if it moves, you can take b5 with check. Okay, now black doesn't have to move it, but let's see what happens if he does. There's only one square. We've got all of these squares are off limits, and so the only square is right there on f5. And if black does that, we're going to play bishop takes b5 check. And again, we're doing quite well. You can't get away with blocking here on c6, so you're going to have to block with a minor piece, like perhaps bishop to d7, and then we can trade off the bishop perhaps like this, and white remains a pawn up, and black doesn't have the bishop pair, and white's doing okay. White's doing pretty well in the position, in fact. Okay, so we're not really worried about that move knight to f5. If you want to keep that knight there as black, what you need to do is counterattack the knight on g5 by moving this knight out of the way. So probably the best move in the position is knight takes d5, counterattacking that knight. Well, that's okay. We're going to trade. We're going to take this knight since it was defending the b5 pawn, forcing black to recover the knight over here. And then we're going to take this with check. And you're going to be displacing the black king. It won't be able to castle. It's going to have to move here. Turns out the best move is to move it over to d8. You don't want to move it up to e7 and blocking your bishop. You can block the check with your bishop, but then white will just trade bishops here and the king will be displaced anyway. And black probably does better to keep this bishop as an attacking unit on the king side here where white is about to castle. So king to d8 is the natural move there. Now, the best move in this position for white, I believe, and the engine says the best move is to castle, which looks a little dangerous because this knight and this queen are pretty close to the king side. This bishop is pointed over there. Maybe even the dark squared bishop can get into an attack. But white can defend. White should be able to develop here and defend the position. If you want to get some surprise wins as black, though, this might actually be a good variation. The Ulvestad naturally leads to this position as the main line, and it can be dangerous. White can fall into a lot of tactics. All right, but let's discuss a few moves here for black. One move I faced in a recent game was knight to f4, which threatens a checkmate here on g2. And I made a mistake, which indicates how dangerous this opening can be. I defended against that mate by playing queen to f3 and got into a lot of trouble. So queen to f3 leads to knight to h3 check. The pawn is pinned, so the king must move. And then the best move in the position, which my opponent didn't play. My opponent actually played bishop to g4 here, but I still got into trouble. The best move is to push the pawn, and that reveals an attack on the b5 bishop, simultaneously attacking the queen, and this position is a tactical mess. Okay, for example, the best move is to take the pawn and threaten the rook in the corner. So it seems like you're saving your bishop because of the rook hanging, but you're not. Black's best response is to take the bishop anyway and threaten white's rook on f1, which, if taken, would be a mate. So white cannot allow that mate. He can't take the rook, so he has to defend, and probably the best way to defend here is to push the pawn to d3 to block out the queen and get this bishop developed. Okay, and now this knight is still hanging and the rook in the corner is hanging, so maybe white's winning material, but no, black has rook to b8, and now white cannot take the knight. Do you see what black's response is? Yeah, black wins the queen by pinning it with bishop to b7. White can block for a move, but black is going to win the queen. So this is a tactical mess. It's very difficult to play this in a blitz game, for example. So if you want some surprise victories with the black pieces, try this Ulvestad variation. But let me go back to the correct way I should have met this move, knight to f4. The engine tells me I should have played bishop to c6. And this is a good move to remember. In a lot of lines in this variation, the bishop belongs on c6 to defend the g2 square. And it's pressuring the rook here on b8. So black's move would be rook to b8 to save the rook. And then we can just continue to develop with a move like d3 and maybe even remove one of the attacking units here on f4, and white's doing fine. Okay, besides knight to f4, black can make other moves in the position. For example, if black moves the rook to b8 now to attack our bishop, again, you want to remember the bishop belongs here. It belongs as a defender of the g2 square. Okay, and probably black would take this pawn to reveal a defender on his knight, and then maybe white can play d3 here and attack the queen, and the game continues. Okay, and yet another move in the position here is bishop to b7, which does put pressure on g2, so if this knight moves out of the way, there's a mate threat. And there, the move I recommend, and the move the engine recommends, is queen to f3, which pins the knight to the bishop. Okay, and you should be able to defend the position from here. All right, so that is the danger of the Ulvestad variation, is this position. How should white defend this kind of really messy position? Even though he's up a pawn, he's got these double isolated d-pawns here, and you could try other moves, but I've had success with castling, and that's the engine move, that's the book move in the position, but you need to know how to defend against all of these pieces that are coming into the attack. One more thing I'll say in this video is, in addition to this Ulvestad variation, which is this move b5 counterattacking the bishop, there's another variation, a rare variation that is related to it because it often transposes into it, which is the move knight to d4. This is called the Fritz variation. So if you see the Fritz variation, what you want to do is just threaten that knight right away with c3, and that knight is defending the b5 square, so black's point here is to play b5. But this transposes back into the Ulvestad after we play bishop to f1, and we're in that same position that we just analyzed. So the Fritz will generally just transpose into the Ulvestad, although there are some possible independent lines. Okay, thanks for watching the video. I hope you learned something. I sure did.